Okay, so still under lockdown and still not able to see theatre. I'm going to continue to make video reviews of plays you probably haven't heard of, Australian plays you probably haven't heard of. Today's play is a play called Daybreak. I'm not sure if that's... There we go. Daybreak is a terrific play from the late 1930s, 1938 to be specific, that was originally performed by the Hobart Repertory Theatre. It's set in the 1830s in Hobart. It tells a familiar story of colonial life. It's set in a fine home that is served by and surrounded by convicts who are still labouring to build the institutions and the buildings of the colony. The house is owned by Simon Martell, who is a very strict, very Christian patriarch to a family that seems like it is mostly made up of women, and has come out here from, or have come out here from London. The story itself mainly focuses on his daughter Jean, who has recently arrived in Hobart from London and who has met on board the ship that they've come over on Francis Gillen, a young man coming out from England who has socialist tendencies, who on board, the two of them, if not quite struck up a romance, were certainly spending a lot of time together, walking alone together, discussing ideas, sharing books. And indeed, the first real sign of trouble happens in the first act when a book of poetry by Shelley is discovered by Jean's sister, and she quickly urges Jean to put it away and make sure father doesn't see it or papa doesn't see it, which he very quickly discovers and thunders about the impropriety of having a poet of such doggerel verse, as he calls it, in his house, and worries that not only that it's a corrupting influence on Jean, but also that her behaviour on board the ship is also unbecoming, and prefers her to remain silent on matters of social justice. She wants to talk about the way the convicts are being treated, and he would prefer that she get in with the local ladies' clubs who have presented some lovely floral arrangements this season, and that she might better be served putting her energies towards that. It's exactly what you would expect for the time. It is a kind of mannered play. It is a kind of melodramatic play. The story of Jean and Francis Gillen's growing love affair is couched in terms of the social life of the upper class in Hobart, that Francis disapproves of, which comes to a head at a party at their house, in which Francis disagrees with everybody else about the treatment of the convicts and the rightness of how the power structures in the new colony are being constructed, suggesting that the rich in the colony have relied on slave labour with the convicts. Of course, none of the people at the party are pleased to hear this, and eventually not only does he leave the party, but Jean is forbidden by Papa, by Simon Martell, to ever see him again. She continues an illicit affair with him, and that affair kind of comes to a fairly sudden end where he attempts to flee the island. Simon Martell and his friends write to Francis's father back in England, saying that he's not a fit person to be in the colony, and his father calls him home. Rather than go home, Francis takes a boat and a bunch of convicts, a bunch of escaping convicts, wants Jean to come with him, but she refuses, and it all ends rather suddenly with Francis getting on the boat and going. In the meantime, there has been a convict romance happening on the property as well. The house servant Phoebe Moon, who is a female convict still serving out her sentence, has fallen in love with the convict Rufus Bellamy, and not only is this forbidden, but she sneaks away from the house with him for what is described as an illicit meeting. The undertone of it is that this meeting is sexual. They're caught, and Simon Martel not only upbraids them for being irredeemably low kind of characters, but sends Phoebe Moon back to the women's institution and has Rufus Bellamy flogged, which results in the Bellamy character kind of losing all hope. The only reason he had been being a relatively model character with only one blemish to his name, and with Phoebe Moon sent back to the female prison, Rufus Bellamy has nothing left to lose and becomes filled with resentment and a simmering kind of presence underneath. He does not escape with Francis Gillen. He remains on the property working, however, and it all comes to a head very quickly at with the third act, a very short sort of third act in which weeks have passed since the escape attempt, and word reaches the family finally that the escapees had been hunted down, and that in the ensuing conflict between the officers and the convicts, Francis has been shot and killed. Spoilers, I suppose. Though the play describes, or at least the characters relating the story, the officers who tell Jean and the family what has happened, state that one of the other convicts had moved to fire upon the officers. Francis had stepped in to stop him, and so the convict shot Francis, which strikes me as not being entirely reliable. It seems more likely that the armed soldiers probably gunned down the entire lot. The conclusion is that Simon Martel went with them as well, has come back and is somewhat unhinged, is imagining an uprising of the criminals, or is attempting at least to crack down on the convicts in Hobart, while he is in the process of raving about keeping his daughters more in control and getting control of the convict population and cracking down with on punishment. This is where Rufus Bellamy returns and sneaks up on the old man and brains him to death. So it's a highly melodramatic play. There are at least 2 instances of symbolic thunderstorms in it, but for all that, it's actually still really quite accessible. There are some of the kind of earlier plays, the more melodramatic plays that form part of the Australian canon that are more wordy, more given towards flourishes of huge emotion, whereas this one I think still reads really well with a contemporary eye. Like, if you were to play it simply and straight as the play I think it presents itself, I think you would miss a lot of the subtlety of the politics in it, the kind of feminist and socialist politics that underpin a great deal of the play, and it's worth. I think it's a play that's worth remounting now, in a similar vein to the way Here Theatre restaged Louis Esson's The Time Is Not Yet Ripe. Catherine Shepard's one of those playwrights, one of those Australian playwrights that has largely been forgotten, but she was a prolific playwright at the time, between the 30s and the 60s, writing something like 20 different plays. A lot of her work was focused on radio drama, as she's a writer worth remembering and bringing back into the canon.